Ebes, before I ask the both of you some questions, I think there are some other special people in the audience we should acknowledge.
Yes, I just want to make a couple of quick acknowledgments. One, there is the wonderful Alan Schwartz, who is here from LA, and Alan was super influential in helping make the film and was a close friend and legal counsel to Truman, and has been the real garter of the Capote estate and making sure that the literature lives on. And so I'm not sure where Alan is, but Alan Schwartz is here, and there's the hand, there's the man. And of course, we also have we're lucky to have Dotson Rader here. Where are you, Dotson?
There we go.
Stand up, Dotson.
Is he in the film? Yeah.
And we also, and I'm not sure if Taylor Plimpton is here, but Taylor was here representing the Plimpton family. Are you here, Taylor? Okay. And then also, I want to just acknowledge Kate Harrington, who is here with us today.
You're very blessed to have people like Kate and Dotson in your film when you have great storytellers like that. Andre, can you describe what Truman Capote meant to you?
Yes, of course. Well, I love Truman Capote's writings because it impacted me, because it was similar to my background, my upbringing. He had his Aunt Sook, I had my grandmother. So when I read A Thanksgiving Memory when I was very young, and I saw it on CBS in the black and white with Geraldine Page, it so impacted the way me and my grandmother, I lived in the house with my grandmother, she was my best friend, and we also prepared fruit cakes for the holiday season, and then they were stored away for Christmas. They were prepared 6 weeks ahead of time, but we gave them to our relatives. We didn't send them to the White House. So Truman Capote, I first discovered Truman Capote through A Thanksgiving Memory, and then I loved his work, and I thought his work was some of the best writings in American literature, and then I was happy to meet him when I got to New York in 1974, and I worked at Interview magazine. I think Dotson Rader was very alive around that time. I never met Dotson, but I certainly met Truman through Andy Warhol, and I went up to Truman's apartment at the UN Plaza, and I used to see him at Studio 54. But what really impacted me was his writing, his body of literature, In Cold Blood, Breakfast at Tiffany's. So that's why I so much was so happy when he asked me to be in this film about basically the black and white ball, which of course I was not around for the famous legendary black and white ball. It was 1966, right?
66.
I was just in high school.
Ebes, what did Truman Capote mean to you that drew you to this project?
I was reading. I mean, I'd grown up reading Capote, and I loved the work. And then I was reading a biography of Bill Paley about the founding of CBS. And when I finished the biography, I found that the two people I was most drawn to were Babe Paley and Truman Capote, and that relationship. And it was almost like watching, you watch Will and Grace, and you're drawn to Karen and Jack in a certain way, and that was what really sent me back to rereading all of the work, and then to exploring a person that I thought, certainly because the two feature films, obviously with Philip Seymour Hoffman, Capote, and with Toby Jones in Infamous, I thought, gosh, everything's been done. And then I went back and I felt like neither story, they talked about the writing of In Cold Blood, but I didn't feel like either story told the depth of this incredible life.
Andre, when you saw the film, what stood out about Ebes's treatment of it to you?
That he let the people speak who had voices. I was so impressed with the audio of Lee Radziwill and Slim Keith, right? Yeah. I think the only voice that was missing was Deanna Vreeland, right?
Yeah.
Because she was very close to Truman, too. But I really was impressed with the voices, the voiceovers, and the old-fashioned tapes running, and you're hearing the voice is so beautiful. Lee, it was a close friend of mine, Lee Radziwill. She just passed away this year. It was so beautiful what she said, how he suffered every day with that yellow legal pad. I thought that was incredible. By the way, you see Lee in the front of the film running into the legendary black and white ball with Prince Radziwill, so that's something I'd never seen before. And also, I loved the people he had in the film. Bob Colacello, I thought, stood out. He had wonderful things to say about Truman. And he certainly knew Truman much more, deeply more intimate than I did. I really loved that. I saw Andy Warhol in the film. Did I not go into the ball? Yeah.
Going in.
Yeah, going in. But I thought that the voices of Lady Keith and Lee Radziwill and Morella Agnelli, I mean, she just passed away too. All the swans, he invented the swans for Vogue, they're dying, they're gone. You know, they're gone this year. There's Morella and there's Lee. And it's extraordinary that your film is coming out, and congratulations for doing such a great work.
Thank you.
Clap, clap if you like it. Clap.
While we're thinking about that, there is some news that's going to be announced next week. Right?
Yes, we have just signed our distribution deal, so we will announce that early next week. So
Congratulations.
forthcoming.
Ebes, what was very striking to me talking to you about the film is that when you began, you didn't know that these tapes existed.
No, I had no idea. I, of course, had read George Plimpton's incredible biography, Oral History, and certainly a lot of other Plimpton work. And then through a great family friend was introduced to Sarah Plimpton, George's widow, who has been an extraordinary champion and partner in this. And she said, you know, George worked on this for 10 years, and the book was a bestseller. And she said, I've got these, you know, maybe there's something in the tapes. And they were in a storage unit, I think, or somewhere. And yeah, and then we digitized and we got them out and just started listening and transcribing and reading and seeing what was there. And it was an incredible gift. And I think also, I hope at least, both in terms of Truman, but also in terms of hopefully reintroducing and introducing George Plimpton and that body of work to new audiences and a new generation as well.
In approaching Truman Capote, you could make a portrait of him just focusing on his artistry. You could make a different portrait of him focusing on some of his more disappointing characteristics as a human being. You really attempted to do a complex portrait that did justice to both, I feel. And you know, I'd love to hear from each of you your perspective on Capote's complexity and, you know, and why it's important to acknowledge both sides of his personality.
I think it's really easy, especially today, for people to get put in a box of some sort. And I think it's easy to forget that we are multifaceted individuals. And so, you know, you talk about Capote or you hear about him and, you know, you think, oh, was he a tiny terror? You know, was he just kind of, as someone said, you know, a mean queen? And I think one of the turning points for me, certainly, was meeting Kate. And I'm a big believer that I think everybody has some good in them, for sure. And I think often we see what may be negative characteristics that are amplified for any number of reasons. But I think it's really difficult when you see someone who is, in essence, raised children, whether they be your children, whether they be a nephew or a niece, whether they be a grandchild, when someone pours love and inspiration and soul into another person, and you see that person as an extraordinary person. You know, Kate is also, you know, an extraordinary creative, but also a mother, and she's a daughter named Truman, which I also think is an amazing fact and an amazing nod to the love and support and inspiration that he was. So once I had that piece, I think for me, the whole film was able to have a soul that in a way it didn't have before.
Well, I came to New York in 1974, 75, and Truman was, at that point, the social literary lion of New York. He was socially connected to everyone. I could see him at Dion van Furstenberg's apartment on New Year's Eve, as well as Studio 54 on the Banquette. But he was also still, at that point, very close to very important socialites like C.Z. Guest. And C.Z. Guest and I were very close friends, and she was coming out with her book on gardens, vegetable gardens, and Truman wrote the whole thing about the rich have better vegetables than you and I. And Truman wrote that, and Cece decided she was going to promote her gardening with her jumpsuits, and they were pale green. And I was working at Women's Wear Daily, and this is how I actually met Truman, through Cece. And Cece said, "Oh, Andre, come up to my pied-à-terre and bring a photographer from Women's Wear, and we're going to photograph my jumpsuits, her gardening jumpsuits. I mean, they weren't for the masses. They were like, 500 suits. She probably gave them away. And there stood Truman Capote in her leopard-covered apartment in the living room with the jumpsuit on, and they did this extraordinary photograph, which is in the annals of Women's Wear Daily. They sort of did like a fandango together in the jumpsuits. And that's what I knew about Truman. He was very witty. He was very sophisticated. He stood for a great body of work. At the same time, I once had a phone conversation with him briefly, because I was at Women's Wear Daily, but we were trying to get him to do a big interview, and he was at Silver Hill, the rehab. And he came on, he didn't want to admit that he was at Silver Hill. He said, "I'm in Smith Hill." And I said, "Well, can I come up there and do it?" And he says, "Well, call me back." But, then, of course, we never got there. But he was a very wonderful person, and I didn't see those kind of things you said that were complex. I didn't see him as a mean person. I do think he had a lot of problems after he did the unanswered prayers. And I was in New York when Liz Smith wrote that Esquire piece, and they all just tanked. They, Babe Paley, Lady Keith. I was with Slim Keith in the De La Renta's house in the Dominican Republic in August, one August. And Lady Keith was a very close friend of Oscar and Francoise, his first wife. And they were talking around lunch table about, "Oh, we'll never speak to him again. He just betrayed us." Because that article had come out where, Lady Ina Coolbirth and all that. So it was all very fascinating to me. But the most of the things, I always look back that I thought, no matter what he did, he was a great writer. You have to respect him for that. And then he gave this legendary ball. I mean, even though I was in high school, Vogue magazine did 9 pages on it, narrated by Gloria Steinem. She had the byline. And there were great pictures of Lauren Bacall with Jason Robards, Dee Dee Ryan, the late Dee Dee Ryan, Tallulah Bankhead, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when I'm just a little boy in North Carolina in high school, looking at Vogue magazine, when everybody thought I should be on the basketball court, but I was, of course, looking at Vogue, this was my ultimate escape, and I was aspiring to meeting these people like Truman Capote. And I met Truman Capote. And I met Lee Radziwill, and she became my very close friend. And a sincere friend. It wasn't just a superficial friendship. So I knew Lee and Truman when they were close. Then they had the falling out when Liz Smith, she got Lee to say, Truman was fighting with whom?
With Gore.
Gore. And Lee was somehow distant related to Gore. And then Lee at one point said, "Oh, they're just a bunch of fags. What do you care for, Liz?" And that followed her, that followed her through the rest of her life.
Yeah.
But they were very close. Lee was dressed at Saint Laurent, and Truman paid the bills for when she was on the stage in Laura, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So she had a great friendship with Truman, and of course Morella Agnelli. Morella Agnelli invited him on the yacht with Johnny, and they were very close friends. So I don't see him as this mean person, but he probably was very wicked.
One thing the film really does well is give a context to who Truman was in the culture early on, and that he would go on television and he'd be himself, and the real bravery of that, I think the film highlights well. And I mean, Eves, I wonder if you can reflect on that.
Well, I just think, again, it's easy for us today to look up and we think, "Oh, well, you see interracial couples," and you're like, "No big deal." You see gay couples, you see lesbian, you see couples, and you're like, "Oh, well, transgender couples." You see whatever, and you think, no big deal. And I think, it was a big deal. This is pre-Stonewall. This is, it was extraordinary to have that sense of self and that bravery. And I think, and I go back to, again, to be able to create a family for yourself in a time when a gay single man, a gay couple was not adopting a child. It was not surrogacy was not an option.
It wasn't the option.
Yeah.
And Truman was the first unabashed, unapologetic gay literary icon figure in America. And it was just by his own organic fluidity. He went on television. He was very outlandish. He wore these extraordinary clothes from Pierre Cardin. He was just small, and his voice also helped, of course. But, this was just, people still respected him. I mean, he was on the Dick Cavett show. He was on a talk show, all the talk shows. And he was just an extraordinary man. People, I think, looked up to him.
Andre, would you have seen him on television before you came to New York? Do you remember?
Maybe once or twice. Who was it? Merv Griffin. I think it was on Merv Griffin. Yeah. But what I wanted was when I read Thanksgiving, A Thanksgiving Memory, and every Thanksgiving, me and my grandmother would sit down and look at that on TV, the black and white CBS special. Was it on CBS, I think? So that's what I remember the Truman. So before I got to New York, I had already ingrained it in my head. And then I got to New York, and with the Warhol studio, the factory, there was all this rumblings, and there was Bob, and there was Truman, had the Esquire magazine, and Liz Smith, and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And Lee Ratz was on a cover interview, and then she was out there in Montauk following Truman around when he did the Rolling Stones.
Peter Beard.
Peter Beard, the Rolling Stones, when they did this big. She went on tour with Truman when she followed the Rolling Stones around America.
A couple of years ago, the film I'm Not Your Negro came out about James Baldwin, and I think it really helped people rediscover Baldwin. He was hiding in plain sight, maybe.
Brilliant.
Brilliant piece. And I feel like when I saw this film, I felt it kind of shined a new light on Truman Capote's career for me. And I wonder what you think Truman Capote's work has to say to us today in 2019, 2020.
Well, it just says to me he was a great writer. It was a very great, extraordinary writer, like one of the greatest. Udora Welty, Faulkner. He was just an extraordinary man, like Tennessee Williams. He's up there with the giants. And one has to admire him for his body of work, although after the unanswered prayers short stories, he didn't do much after that. But there's a great body of work there. And he was already famous when he was like 21 or 22. Right? Other Voices of the Room?
Other Voices of the Room.
Yeah, and he was pouting on the sofa in a photograph by Mr. Penn or Avedon or somebody, the New Yorker magazine. So he is a great literary writer, and he's not to be he's not to be taken for granted. I think people should be teaching courses on Truman Capote, and his film should be shown in the courses at the Ivy League schools.
Not just the Ivy Leagues.
Well, the colleges, whatever.
No,
the private schools, whatever. The finishing schools, whatever. The schools.
The schools.
Yeah.
I think if anything, when I was watching the Oscars a couple of years ago, and Viola Davis won, and she stood up and she talked about the fact that the best stories are in the graveyard, and it resonated with me because I think this is a life that deserves full examination, and the work. Whether it's the short stories, whether it's Miriam, whether it's Thanksgiving Memory, whether it's Breakfast.
In Cold Blood.
In Cold Blood. The work still resonates when I went back and I read through everything, reading Miriam again was still as eerie as it was. I was like, what is that little girl doing? Like, why is she over there? It still resonates, and there's still, and I think now, more importantly, the work in context with the times that we're in today, because you can go back and you can read Breakfast at Tiffany, and you can see that, it's not, as I think Sadie says, it's not the sweet little love story. It's a rough situation for this young woman. And so we can go back and look at what he wrote and the honesty and the craftsmanship that went into it.
Let's take some questions from the audience. If you raise your hand, I'll call it right in the middle there in the blue. So he's singling out a couple images. One, the breaking wine glass when the first answered prayers excerpt comes out, and also the cookies at the end that are.
Oh yeah.
The wine glasses. It took a while to get to. We played with a lot of different things. Obviously, it was a moment because it was a shift in the film. So I knew there had to be something that signified that. And obviously, I wanted to carry that theme. Well, first of all, everybody drank. And so it's amazing when you listen to the audio tapes, because what's not in the film is you hear Lauren Bacall saying, George, darling, get me another vodka. And then you hear Slim Keith, you hear George Plimpton saying, is this thing on? And then you hear Slim Keith say, well, I'm fixing another drink. Do you want one? So there was something about that glassware and those lunches and that drinking that was throughout. And then the cookies was really a gift from Andre, because he talked about, being at auction and wanting to buy. The thing he didn't get to buy was a box of cookies.
No, Truman travels throughout his entire life, from the time he lived with his Aunt Sook till he was a famous man. And when he died, there was an auction house on the Upper West Side, and they sold his things. And they sold his Pierre Cardin coats with a zipper. I have his sofa, the famous sofa in the portrait. It's got the original palm chintz, the sofa, the Victorian sofa. I think I got it for like $600. Nobody went to the sale. But one of the most remarkable things were, and I regret that I did not buy it, there was a box of gingerbread cookies his Aunt Sook had made, and that went for auction, and they were desiccated. They were almost decimated. It was just like, you think if you opened the box and there was a mummy's ashes in it. It was just dust. And I regret I didn't buy it, but I thought it was spooky to have the gingerbread cookies. So, and I'm not going to spend $2,000. Someone spent $2,000 for the gingerbread cookie. And then there was the baby blanket, the handmade, crocheted baby blanket that he traveled with. They found when he died in Joanna Carson's house in California.
Yeah.
The baby blanket, and that went for something like $3 or $4 grand, and that I do regret not having. But to think that baby blanket went with Truman throughout his entire life, he kept those two things. He kept the gingerbread cookies, and he kept the baby blanket, and somebody has that. They kept his passports. I have a few of his ashtrays, Tiffany stuff, junk. But I should have bought the gingerbread cookie. But that tells you a lot, that traveled with him, and he remembered that. He kept this very crumbling gingerbread cookie his Aunt Sook had made. Thank you for putting that in the film.
No, well, and I think to answer your question, it was super important. I mean, we played with that. I played with that moment constantly, because I knew it was important. And at first it was somewhere else, and then it was at the end, and then it was not in it, but I knew it had to be in, because again, it gave him a soul. This idea that no matter how far we go from wherever we came, we are fundamentally who we are. We're who we were raised as, and you can be on a great yacht, but you're still a relatively orphaned child who found love with Sook. It is what it is.
And her gingerbread cookies.
And her cookies.
Yeah.
Question right here. The first part of that was a tribute to the film made about Andre a couple years ago,
which
The
is
Gospel
great.
According to Andre.
It's out. You've seen it. So
So the question was, what did Truman Capote mean
the
to
sissy
these
boy
two?
mean to us, the two black boys.
The two black boys.
Well, let me just say, the sissy boy meant a lot to me, because having been a sissy down in the deep, deep South, I often lived in a world of deep insecurity and fear. And when I discovered Truman Capote had gone into New York and gave this extraordinary ball for the late Kay Graham, and the 540 people, the most extraordinary people in the world came, Candice Bergen, Andy Warhol, Tallulah Bankhead, Cristiano Brandolini, Lauren Bacall, and this was in Vogue. Of course, I discovered it in Vogue. Later, I discovered the whole thing. There's a book about the black and white ball. But more than that, it was the book, A Christmas Memory. I would read The Christmas Memory, A Thanksgiving Memory, every Thanksgiving with my grandmother, and we watched the television show. And that was one of my favorite shows. Ever. I would watch it religiously every year. So the sissy who was writing meant a lot to me. It was one of my greatest inspirations. And I got to meet the sissy.
Mine isn't that far off from Andre's, to be perfectly honest. I grew up in northern Florida, South Georgia. I spent a lot of time in New York, certainly, but I'm a Southerner. And again, the writing was very Southern. The person was extraordinarily eccentric, but and I knew that I was black, and it took me a little time to realize that I was gay, but I was fascinated at an early age. The work was beautiful, but there was something about this person that was other. And so I think no matter who you are, if you have ever felt, and it doesn't have to be race related, I don't think, if you've ever felt other, you can be, a fabulous redhead in a sea of brunettes. And if you feel other, there's something to hold on to when you identify other people who felt other. And also, and I think Mailer says it best when he says a lot of people didn't make it as far as Truman made it, didn't have that success. And you look back at that time, and even not that long ago, where, if you were gay and young, you were killed and dragged behind a truck, or you were, there's the hardships that whoever you are, have experienced and continue to experience is something that is universal. And so I think what I hope is this is a film that can let people also know that you like Truman, you can go well beyond where you think you may be able to be.
Through his gifts of writing, he
That's
went
right.
beyond. He went beyond through his gift of writing. Those people embraced him because of his talent, Morella Agnelli and the Yacht and the Lady Keith. I mean, once he became this famous writer, they all embraced him. They wanted him at their dinner table to be amused by him. His personality was so unique and so different that otherness was so charismatic to the social elite. They didn't have that kind of person at their dinner table.
Yeah.
They didn't have Truman Capote as their best friend. Bay Paley. I mean, she probably, when she met Truman, she probably hit the mother load as a best friend.
Yeah.
And he could be he was candid, and yet he was very cozy until he really dropped the ball with unanswered prayers. And I don't know how he dropped the ball, but he did. He made a big mistake because those people immediately read this and they just betrayed. They just let him go forever, and he's a writer. Of course, he is like Henry James or Edith Wharton or Proust. Proust was inspired by the Parisian society and elite, but Proust didn't tell the stories of people having affairs and having their periods and leaving the sheets stained.
All right, we'll take a couple more questions. Right here.
Over here, there's a lady.
So the question was about Philip Seymour Hoffman's performance as Truman Capote and what you thought he captured.
There were two movies at that time that came out around the same time. And so there was Capote, which was based on the book by Gerald Clark, which starred Philip Seymour Hoffman, for which he won the Oscar. And then there was Infamous, which starred Toby Jones. In some ways, Toby was better. I think the caliber of acting for Philip Seymour Hoffman, the physicality that he took on in really becoming Capote was also an interesting thing. So what I will tell you is, again, both those films, I think, captured a specific moment in time. It was Capote writing in cold blood, and neither one really went too far outside of that.
All right, question over here. So she was commenting on the composition of the film, the archival, the graphics, and how you arrived at some of these visual ideas.
I went back and I wanted it to be kind of like an old Vanity Fair. That was what was in so the graphics, the type, all of that for me, it was, I wanted to feel like I was flipping a page and seeing something beautiful, or an old Life magazine, or, I wanted it to be something rich. And we had these disparate pieces that had to be quilted together. And so that's just literally what it was. And then just trying to piece it is a big jigsaw puzzle, but it was a lot of fun putting it together.
Andre, to give you the last word, the worlds that this film evokes, of which you got to see some as a young man, what do you think is in that world that's missing from today?
Authenticity. Truman was authentic. the authentic, great literary giant. Authenticity. The great people that I was lucky enough to meet who've gone on, they were authentic, whether they were fashion icons or models, or the great Naomi Sims, the black model, was extraordinary, but she was authentic. Deanna Vreeland, Lee Radziwill, authenticity. And being unique and you being yourself with a kind of a moral standard. They had moral codes. It was a moral standard to be well-dressed. It was a moral standard to go to the hairdresser and have your hair combed out before you took an airplane, instead of getting on an airplane in some hot sweats and stuff like that. You know, they had moral codes about dress. And they took it seriously, because Mrs. Vreeland used to have her shoes, the soles of her shoes, polished with the rhinoceros horn. That somehow she found the rhinoceros horn, and her assistants used to polish the soles of those shoes that hit the floor. And she did not walk on the soles, she walked on her tippy toes. And the worst, she said, I can't stand to hear the secretary come down the hall, click, clack, click, clack. So she walked on her toes like a ballerina on point. And then she had her $5 bills pressed by Yvonne, her French maid. The French maid had to iron the $5 bill before she went to dinner, because in those days they didn't have Uber, you had yellow cabs. So Mrs. Vreeland would go out to dinner with an escort, most likely, but she'd have a $5 bill in case she had to get home alone in a cab in her Chanel quilted pochette. So all these standards were important to these people. I mean, Mrs. Vreeland's hair dye was flown in from Paris. The FDA could not approve it. So she had to smuggle in the hair dye from Carita of Paris. You may think that's funny, but these are amazing things that matter to these women. Mrs. Vreeland didn't know where her kitchen was. One night she said, I want a peanut butter sandwich. Where's my kitchen? I haven't been in the kitchen in 35 years. I said, Mrs. Vreeland is right over there. Let's go. But, you know, this authenticity, and I really respected that. I found it in Truman. I thought it was extraordinary in the great ladies, the Swans, Morella Agnelli. I didn't meet Morella Agnelli, but I remember Vicomtesse de Rive was one of Truman's Swans. She's still with us, and that is really authenticity with her clothes and everything. But Lee Radziwill, just extraordinary. You know, Lee Radziwill died in February. And then one day I get a phone message, an email from the executive of her estate. We're sending you a little package, a small thing. So I go on my porch, and there's a white box, half unopened. Someone's brought it to me by hand. And in this box with a red ribbon is a framed photograph of Lee and I at a Vanity Fair party, and then a Mongiardino leopard cushion. And the note, it says, from her executor, Lee wanted you to have this. And she went around her apartment before she died, and she picked out everything for all her close friends. And when she went by this pillow, she said, send this to Andre, he would love it. So I wasn't the only one that got these special gifts. There's a list of people who got these special gifts. And, you know, she planned her own funeral. I mean, it was the most extraordinary funeral I've ever been to in my life. But she planned it. She sat down at her writing desk and wrote out every detail, from the sweet peas in February to the music, to the poems, to the readings, to who would read, et cetera, et cetera. So these things meant a lot. CZ Guest was like that. She was a great friend of Truman. And CZ said, I'm the only one of Truman's friends who I never talked about anything that was involved my family. Of course he was going to write about it. So she remained friends when all the others dropped him. So it was a world of authenticity.
And Ebes, what do you see in that world that you're trying to pull out?
I'm just trying to pull out that there's glamour. There was glamour, and people should know about it. And
I was
there's
asking
glamour
Ebes.
today. Huh? And he has done a great film. And I would hope that everyone will see this film.
I hope so too. Thank
And
you.
I will embrace the film anytime
You
you
already
have me.
have.
And
You're the
I'm
best.
so impressed to be in the film so much.
You're the
Because
best.
he asked me to, I didn't even know who he was. And I don't know how you found me. I think through Desiree or some Rogers or something. Oh, yeah, Desiree, hi. So Desiree just bought Ebony Fair, Fashion Fair, something. She bought something, cosmetics. But so Desiree and I came across when the Obamas went to the White House. And so I said, yes, of course I'll be in the film. And I went to the Plaza Hotel. It was cold and freezing in that big ballroom. And I said, just send me the magazine so I can refresh myself, because I didn't have the old Vogue. But I have the old Vogue in my head, the close-ups, the Lauren Bacall dancing with Jason Robards, Cristiano Brandolini, all the Babe Paley. And you got to get the book, because the book tells you about the whole history of how these women went to buy their clothes for the black and white ball, how Candace Bergen had the white mink bunny tails, Lee Radziwill. And I said to Lee before, years ago, Lee, where's that dress you wore to the black and white ball? Oh, I don't know. I don't keep my old clothes.
All right, I was going to wrap up, but I see a very insistent hand here, so I want to give you a chance. In essence, she's asking about the music in the film.
Honestly, it was the only way that I could really add in ethnicity. And it was really important to me because as a black man talking about an era and talking about an author, a specific person, and the world that he lived in was just, the reality is it was just a very white world. And so it was beyond important to me that my culture, and which was not just my culture, but which was also the culture of the era, since I couldn't really show it in telling his story, the only way that I could, thank you, by the way, thank you for recognizing that. The only way that I could tell it was through the music. But that was my way of diversifying the film as best I could. Thank you.
Great last question. This is the closing night film of Doc NYC. I hope we see you again next year.